Good morning, everyone, and thank you to CEDA for the opportunity to talk to you about the political overview for the year ahead. We've all heard by now many times, and the Prime Minister reminded Queensland of it again this week, it's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian. I would modify that statement and say it's never been a more exciting time to be a gallery journalist. Policy-wise, I think we're in for a really exciting time this year, a true policy debate, the likes of which we've not had for years. And I think for that, the opposition actually deserves some credit for that, but more on that in a moment. In the 24/7 environment with Twitter, BuzzFeed, Periscope, life has really sped up and it's not going back into second gear anytime soon. Hands up those of you who know what Periscope is, and I'm not talking about the things on submarines. Couple of hands. Periscope is an app that you can put on your smartphone and you can beam live pictures in an event that you're doing to your followers. So it's like, if you like, it's like a mobile TV studio without all the studio people to make it happen, without journalists there filtering your message. A lot of politicians are using this already to beam their press conferences live to their followers. So, and life, we're going to see more of this kind of thing happen in our political environment. The old political adage that a week is a long time in politics, I think, could be changed. Sometimes a day is a long time in politics. And a little reminder of how quickly some things can and do change. Think about these two things. I last addressed CEDA 2 years ago on politics and giving a political overview. Back then, Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister, Joe Hockey was the Treasurer. Both were working feverishly on creating their signature 2014 budget. A budget which ended up becoming not the foundation stone for budget repair, but a foundation stone really for their career ends. Tony Abbott's no longer the Prime Minister. Joe Hockey's now our chief diplomat in Washington, carving out a diplomatic career. So those things happened in that small, in a relatively small time. We also heard during that time from 2010 to 2013 that coalition figures would never resort to the night of the long knives with assassins taking out a sitting Prime Minister without voters having a say-so. Well, the coalition did exactly that last year, something they said that they would never do. Things do change, and quite quickly in a political environment. So, more than 5 months have now passed since Malcolm Turnbull launched his bid to replace Tony Abbott. At the time when Mr Turnbull took over that job, he said that the polls were pointing to a big electoral defeat and that the Abbott government hadn't provided the economic leadership Australia needed at the time. Mr Turnbull's critics say, well, in that time nothing much has changed. I disagree. I think the tone and tenor have remarkably changed in politics in that time, and to a degree, the public has been relieved that that is the case. And with the change in leader in voters' minds at least, it's brought a sense that this is a new government. It's also given the government to tread into policy areas that had previously been ruled out of the coalition's thinking. The previous Prime Minister who ruled out things like talking about changing superannuation, talking about negative gearing. Those particular big issues are now up for debate. However, the new government and new Prime Minister are yet to clock up any, what I would call, significant runs on the board, and it will need to do that between now and the election to give voters something to judge them on. Voters are loath to tossing out first-term governments. The last time a first-term federal government was tossed out of office was back in 1931. To change to a popular leader pretty much means that the coalition is set for another term federally, barring a major disaster, and that can never be discounted in politics. The last Queensland state election is a testament to that. One of the biggest assets for the federal government is the opposition and its leader. They're perceived as being weak. Bill Shorten is unpopular. Voters aren't convinced that Labor has changed its spots from the Rudd-Gillard years. And I'll come to a little bit more of that in a moment. The economy is still that major political issue for Canberra and for the parties. I don't need to remind you, and Justin has just given us an oversight of that, of how the economy has not returned to the pre-GFC levels that we witnessed. And for policymakers and bean counters, that's been a bit of a disappointment. The mining investment boom has long passed, and the economy, as Justin pointed out, is going through that period of transition. We're going to see iconic legacy manufacturing sectors in Australia, Ford and Holden, begin to close up shop and move offshore from this year. That will sort of sharpen those arguments again as to where is, where are the jobs of the future, where is Australian manufacturing heading to the future. That will sharpen focus and attention on that. The new government and new Prime Minister have very much changed the language on the economy to talk about innovation, to talk about embracing the future rather than being frightened by it. The language has been important in changing the mood of voters and also in lifting business confidence. But now comes the really hard part, governing. Getting runs on the board, showing voters that this is an administration that can govern. Scott Morrison presented here at the Press Club on Wednesday about setting parameters and discussion for his upcoming first budget. He came under the blowtorch yesterday for pretty much, Alan Jones gave him a really hard time. What have you done in 5 months? The need for repair to the budget remains. There are long-term structural problems with it. Programs that are costing too much or perhaps that we're not raising enough money for. Mr Morrison indicated at the Press Club earlier this week that the $80 billion cut that the states, the federal government flagged to the states in 2014 is not going to be reversed. So we're going to see more attention on that. Mr Morrison also emphasised that the way to deliver tax cuts is to reduce spending and the size of government. The federal government's tried that in the past. In the 2014 budget, it tried to cut spending, but it was very much perceived as being unfair and shifting the burden more to the vulnerable in the society. The Senate crossbench and the opposition blocked it, and the public too was largely offside. The government kept open the option of a GST hike until last week, when it said that Treasury modelling apparently didn't provide the ammunition the government wanted to sell it. Some say if a popular Prime Minister is not prepared to burn up political capital in selling it, whenever is the time going to be right to have that discussion about changing the tax mix of the GST? I don't have the answer to that. Economist Chris Richardson recently said that he thought that if the government abandoned this particular issue, that the GST would become the tar baby of federal politics. Maybe he's right. And certainly Scott Morrison said on Wednesday, the time is not right. So presumably the time will be right at some point, but it's certainly not going to be in this cycle anytime soon. The government wanted to have a conversation with people about the tax, but in a conversation where you set no limits, the airwaves are going to be filled with what extreme options possibly could be on the table for discussion. Given that there are only a handful of people discussing and putting the option for a GST rise at that time, and there were some voices from the government side arguing against it, is it any surprise that it's dead? The days of the Big Bang reform are over. Incremental reform is what we're likely to see in the years ahead. And that next wave of reform will be difficult to achieve. If it was easy, it would have been done by now. Explaining the need for change, I think, is what most of the major parties will need to do, plural. And I think both of them will need to admit that the tax cuts and some spending commitments that were made during the commodity boom were a mistake. The boom was not permanent. Yet payments that was distributed to the people were permanently baked into the budget. We're starting to have those conversations now in terms of negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts for investment properties, for family tax benefit B payments, for example. Labor's decision to put forward policies on superannuation and negative gearing have pushed policies that were previously deemed as political poison back into the spotlight for discussion. It's also given this government, the Turnbull government, political cover, if you like, to now examine those options. And that's how good oppositions sometimes help make good governments. Work-related expenses will be the other issue that is tackled this year and is a sleeper issue. It's something that Scott Morrison has asked a parliamentary committee to look at, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see announcements regarding that in the budget. The killing off of the GST for now means that the federation reform is on hold. Talks scheduled for next month with the states to discuss these issues have been placed on hold. I'd be really interested, I'm not sure whether Andrew Barr is still here or not, where he thinks federation reform is going to go into the future. I think more of the spotlight now will go back onto the states and territories about what they're going to do. During the GST debate, some states had already spent the extra proceeds of a tax hike thinking that it was going to help pay for education and health costs. Government MPs were very, very unhappy with this scenario, thinking that they were expected to wear the public opprobrium for money that they weren't even going to be able to talk to voters about. So as I said, earlier, I think a lot of attention will go back onto the states and territories about what sorts of inefficient taxes they might change, stamp duty, payroll tax, that sort of thing. The federal opposition says that the changes in superannuation tax concessions and another planned hike in tobacco excise will help pay for their policies on things like the 6-year full funding agreement for Gonski and for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. As we get closer to the election, I think the work of the Parliamentary Budget Office, as well as their pre-election budget update, will be absolutely critical for journalists and by that extension voters, in giving them an idea as to how serious the major parties are in paying for these policies, as well as addressing the long-term structural problems with the budget. The government is really wary of industrial relations reforms, given the work choice hiding that was delivered to it in the 2007 election. Again, that is why we're going to see incremental change. The government will continue to focus on the restoration of the Australian Building and Construction Commission. Debate is now back in the Senate on this. It's already been knocked back once. A second rejection of this legislation will provide the government with a double dissolution trigger. It already has one double dissolution trigger, and it's around union governance. The government is really keen to do something on penalty rates and also limiting union right of entry into workplaces. There is increasing talk from the government about a double dissolution election. July 2 is also one date that is being frequently referred to. It would make for a really long election campaign because they'd probably have to call it the day after the election. It would also make passing the budget a very interesting proposition there as well. Elections are won and lost in what I call the sensible centre, swinging voters who tend to abhor the extremes in politics. They don't like the extreme left, they don't like the extreme right. And while the government's suggested a double dissolution election might be triggered by a discussion on industrial relations, it would not be the issue that then dominates the election. And it's not an issue, I think, that would persuade that sensible centre into voting governments in and out of office. Trade deals. There'll be some more interest this year on what happens with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, particularly with the US Congress and whether it's going to pass it. No one knows. The new Trade Minister, who was sworn in yesterday, Steve Chobo, will channel all his efforts into carrying on the work of Andrew Robb in getting agreements up with India and the European Union. The Health Minister has quietly got on with some reforms that she's keen to achieve. A review of the thousands of items covered by the Medicare benefit schedule and private health insurance. Susan Lee is focusing on what is good for the consumer, but given the powerful vested interest at play, it's questionable as to how much she will be able to achieve. She will go gently on these reforms, keen to not repeat the mistakes of the Medicare co-payment. Still, some health experts believe there is a lot of waste in the system that we're still not even talking about yet that could help deliver billions of dollars. For more than 2 years, the government's talked and investigated modernising the Medicare payment system, not Medicare itself, but the payment system, as the Human Services Department's IT systems are now nearly 30 years old. It's struggling to keep up. Is it any surprise? The mobile phone wasn't around when the computer system started operating. It's talking with private companies now, and it's also talking with Australia Post about its outsourcing that function. Labor has painted this as the first step to privatising Medicare. Is that fair? Maybe it's a form of political payback, if you like. The Coalition demolished Labor on introducing a carbon tax, even though their policy included a transition through to an emissions trading scheme. Is it fair politics? You know, I don't know. And it depends how that will be argued out in the marketplace over the 6 months ahead. To me, if IT systems are 30 years old, how can you possibly expect that they're going to cope in the modern environment where we have smartphones and we expect to tap and go? Senate voting reform. The next fortnight in Parliament, Parliament's back next week, might see some action for the government on reforming the system to stop what is called a group voting tickets. This is to stop the preference flows that happen from those micro-parties that in 2003 saw so many of those micro-parties end up on the Senate crossbench. The micro-parties are going to fight this all the way. I don't know if you watched last night, but we focused particularly on this and the threats to run a lower house seat campaign against the government. If this does happen in the next sitting fortnight, that is a really strong signal from the government that it is deadly serious about having a double dissolution election, because going to a double dissolution election without that option is rather strange, because the government could potentially end up with more senators on the crossbench. In double dissolution elections, the Senate quota for getting a seat is actually halved, so they could end up with more senators on the crossbench without reform. The biggest challenges for Malcolm Turnbull are these: delivering major runs before he calls an election, otherwise Labor's criticism that he is a do-nothing Prime Minister will start to stick, and stability. As much as the government's critics like to point to people like Tony Abbott, Eric Abetz, Kevin Andrews and claim that the coalition is cracking up every time they pop their heads up, these are reminders to voters, and this is what's come to me internally from the coalition. They're reminders to voters that the government has changed. They're not worried about it really a great deal. It reminds them that Mr Turnbull is in charge, and to Conservatives outside Parliament, it gives them a reminder that the Liberal Party is a very broad church, that there are moderates and there are dries. Even once rusted-on Tony Abbott supporters have told me that they're fully behind Malcolm Turnbull now because of the return of Westminster-style cabinet. And as a result, it's taking the government a longer time to come up with policy decisions, because it's going through all the processes of doing the analysis, commissioning the modelling, so it is taking them longer to land on policy decisions. The interjections that we're hearing from the backbench, party strategists may not like it because certainly, the media focuses on it. The opposition focuses on it because it's all being seen through that leadership prism, even though there is little chance to no chance of Tony Abbott making a return as Prime Minister. Now, Bill Shorten, you can never say never in politics, even though in recent weeks there have been some rumblings within Labor about his leadership. Labor will be absolutely loath to change leader. A third change of leader in 6 years would simply reinforce in voters' minds that Labor's style of politics, their business model, is the revolving door of leadership. So they would be loath to do something like that. But as Jack Lang and I think Bob Hawke used to remind people, if you're backing a horse in a horse race, always back self-interest because you know it's trying. Never discount self-interest in these things. Labor has led the way so far on policy development, on superannuation, negative gearing. Regardless of what you think about their values, they have outlined policy detail. They've put forward policy costings, and at the moment the government hasn't done that. And perhaps that is an acknowledgement and an admission by Labor that to have a chance, any chance at the coming election, that it cannot rely on the popularity of the leader to carry it across the line. It can't afford to be a small target. It has to put forward policy options for voters to make a decision upon. The biggest challenge for the major parties in getting the voters' attention, the voters in that sensible centre that I talked about, is getting their attention. In the 24/7 environment that exists now, and the myriad of blogs that are out there, and the alternative sources for information other than the traditional sources of the media like the ABC and newspapers, more and more voters are getting their information from these sources. And this fragmentation means that voters are seeking information from websites that sometimes validate their own views and thinkings. So, in this 24/7 world, the parties will be devoting more money on social media resources in an attempt to tap into that fragmentation. An example of this, the Labor Party has funded its own electronic news information, Labor Herald, where people are going to it for information. Back in 2014, my closing words to this event was about the early missteps of the Abbott government, a warning that they'd only be regarded as major if the government did not learn from those mistakes. Prophetic words perhaps, given what unfolded last year. As mentioned earlier, voters are absolutely loath to tossing out first-term governments. Yet the Queensland state result shows that voters are not rusted on anymore. If they believe the political leaders are not listening to them and are incapable of change, they will toss them out. And that played a big thinking in a lot of MPs' minds when they decided to back Malcolm Turnbull instead of Tony Abbott. I am not convinced that voters have forgotten the Rudd-Gillard years, and Mr Shorten was a player in that area, and I'm not sure that voters have wiped that completely from their memories, and the government keeps reminding voters of that, and they also are keen to remind them, if you listen to Question Time in recent weeks, of his role in the Australian Workers' Union and the evidence that was presented before the Royal Commission. So there will be issues that continue to dog him. History, as I mentioned, is against Labor. The last first-term federal government that was turfed out was in 1931. So the post-election politics for him, I think, will be absolutely fascinating. But there are absolutely fascinating times ahead, and I am pleased that I'll have a front row seat in delving through it all and telling the public about it. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about it today.